Georg Zachmann, there's a general observation that attention to the issue of climate change has suffered in recent years in the wake of global economic hardship, perhaps pushing a more short-term competitive agenda. How has that affected the quest for renewable energy?
In the past, so if you look back to 2008, when the last energy and climate package was negotiated and adopted, the world looked quite different. So at this time, there was still a big talk about peak oil and peak gas, so that gas and oil will run out, that prices will rise quickly in the not so distant future, that Europe will have difficulties finding oil and gas. And at this time, it seemed a very good bet to very aggressively go for building up capacities of renewable energy sources in Europe in order to avoid this scenario. On top of that, the discussions on climate change at the time were very heated. There was a big expectation that the Copenhagen conference will lead to a positive outcome, a global agreement on decarbonization. Since then, the world has changed dramatically. So the development of unconventional oil and gas, so shale gas as one example. As a result of that, the appetite for quickly using a lot of renewable energy vanished in all parts of the world and also in Europe. The big hope that with going big on renewables, you essentially open up the European economy for something that will become a global market very quickly, where a lot of money can be made by selling Danish wind turbines and German solar panels, seems to be less prevalent now.
Now, is that also because there's perhaps a lack of sufficient incentives for investors at the moment?
Most of the renewables in most places are still significantly more expensive than conventional sources. Europe has strong overcapacities in terms of energy production or electricity production. Also because a lot of renewables have been deployed or constructed in the past 10 years. And old capacities are still in the market. So therefore, the electricity prices in Europe dropped to levels not seen before the crisis. So a less high price for electricity means also for renewables it's more difficult to refinance. On top of that, the support schemes for renewables that have essentially driven all the deployment in the past decade have been cut substantially. All the crisis countries essentially did a complete break of their support policies, Spain, Italy, you name it. Some of them even retroactively changed their support schemes, which decreased investors' confidence in the future. So it will be very difficult to revamp any renewable support in those countries because investors don't believe anymore that those countries will stick to their commitments.
So what would be your message? Why should renewables and renewable energy be higher on the global policy agenda?
Global warming seems to be much more certain than we thought some years ago. All the evidence points to that we are not going to reach the 2-degree target with the policies we are currently on. So we need to be much more aggressive on decarbonization in order not to leave this chartered territory and fall into uncharted territory. And this will only be possible when we find ways to produce the energy we need from low carbon sources. So the biggest challenge we are facing if we want to carry out decarbonization on a global scale is bringing down the cost of renewable energy and other no-carbon technologies below the costs of oil, gas, and coal. That will require substantial investments into these new technologies.
The big question at the moment is, of course, what to do about renewable energy targets. The European Union is contemplating extending its 2020 deadline to perhaps 2030. Would that be helpful?
The current approach to just look into the certain construction target of renewables for 2030 is a too narrow one, because what we really want to achieve is not a certain share of renewables on the energy production in Europe, but what we should want to achieve is to make renewables cheaper in a way so that they can compete on the global market with coal, gas, and oil. And therefore, we should shift our focus from share in the energy mix towards cost reduction of renewable energy technologies. So we want to achieve cost competitiveness of those technologies, and therefore we should not only look into construction, but we also should look into ways of funding, for example, research and development much more aggressively. Just to give you some figures, currently the 5 biggest countries in the European Union have been funding the construction of renewable energy technologies with about 50 billion euros per year. By way of contrast, they have been funding research and development in these areas by some $300–400 million. So you see the difference, and that is certainly an imbalance that, if it's balanced a bit more towards research and development, could make a big difference in terms of the innovation that we are generating.